Welcome, listeners. It's the time for the Genealogy radio show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is all about an event that we had in Lifelong Learning, and we have our radio show about it, which is Brian Boru and the World of DNA. We're very lucky to have Aisling O'Brien and Hannah O'Sullivan, who took part in this and did most of the work on it. Now, Brian Boru and the World of DNA is a fascinating study because Brian Boru's legacy in Ireland is that he would have expelled the Vikings with the Battle of Clontarf and was one of the most famous High Kings of Ireland. Brian, or Brian Bóruma, meaning Brian of the Tributes, later commuted within a generation or two to the O'Brien surname. And in fact, Brian's first name was an unusual first name for the Dalcashian tribes or clans and it came from his mother, Brian, who came from the Mayo side. So Brian's links with the Kennedys and the other families give great legacies, and with the World of DNA, we're very fortunate that we can connect some of those dots, which we previously could not have done so. So welcome, Aisling, to the show today. And what can you tell us about Brian Boru, first of all?
Well, Brian Boru, he's a character in history who could be almost seen as a mythical figure, when in fact he was as much a figure of flesh and blood as you and I. He is from a line called the Dalcashians, as Orna said. Now this line, it was a clan, and their rival clan was the Onux. And they came from a tribe of brothers, their descendants, of Owen Moore and Cormac Cass, and their father, Ulul, wished that them brothers and their descendants would share the crown. Now, this didn't come to be. The Onux have far more kings in their history, but eventually it came to pass that Brian Boru's grandfather, Lorcan, came to get the throne. Eventually, Brian's brother, Mahon, took the throne of Munster, and it was after Mahon was slaughtered by an Onux representative or a Dane. Some of the reports vary on that Brian eventually took became leader of the Dalcashians and eventually King of Munster. His life has bookmarked many bloody and violent battles against the Dane and the Onux. He found himself as an opponent to Mael Shacklin, or Malachi, who was in Ireland, in 980 AD. Mael Shacklin was alarmed by Brian's progress, and he and Brian butted heads on numerous occasions. They actually formed a truce in the year 999 AD, and as they had a common foe, which was the Danes. It wasn't until the year 1002 that Brian took the throne of Ireland, marched on Tara with an intimidating assembly of soldiers that not even Malachi could bring a halt to. And eventually, in the year 1011, he was acknowledged as supreme monarch. Now, this was a huge achievement because Ireland at this point had been split into kingdoms that were constantly quarrelling. Brian managed to bring the country together by taking hostages, it is said, from the northern kings and eventually causing them to submit. He met his death on the fields of Clontarf in the year 1014. But even though he died, it is said that this battle was a victory for Brian as he managed to subdue the Danes. Even though his life seemed bloody and violent, he also had interest, it says, in education and things like that. He was building monasteries in Munster, it is said, and he was even travelling the seas. It's reported that he tried to take back things that were taken from the Irish, like books and artefacts.
Absolutely lovely. And he fits into the history of the Dalcatians and the Dalcash and their tribal history, and many other families do as well. So when we get his descendants, his immediate descendants, who suddenly start taking on the O'Brien as the surname, then we get other surnames appearing as well. So we have the O'Regans, we have the Considines, we have the Kennedys, and we have many more that can be linked directly to the O'Briens. Other clans who are also Dalcashian cannot be biologically linked though, and that's one of the surprising aspects. So it doesn't mean that every surname within the Dalcashin are able to be linked biologically. The McNamaras, for example, except through their marriage links, would not come from a common ancestor. And that's something that is important to see, that what we've got is the mythological leading to a belief that they should, but in fact they don't. So this is where DNA is going to make all the difference, and it's going to be the new frontier in how we view what linkages the clans have to each other. Now we know that Brian Boru's, some of his sons and his grandson died on the battlefield of Clontarf. So who was left to pass on the message? And in relation to our tribal history, what difference does it make? So I know, Aisling, you would have spoken to Dennis O'Brien in relation to the DNA.
Yes, Dennis O'Brien, he was an administrator for the O'Brien Surname Project, which was a branch of one of the projects, the Surname projects from the family tree DNA side. And actually, if any O'Briens listening, especially if they're male, I would advise that they go online and find the site at the homepage, because it's a very interesting project, and it's come forward leaps and bounds in the last couple of years. Now DNA, it's a relatively new concept, I suppose, in that it's constantly changing. I could even probably say that what I'm saying now may be redundant in about 20 years, but what it is now is, it's extraordinary how much they've come forward. We found out that we can have links to, like, the documentary evidence that we have for genealogy may only take us so far, but DNA can take us even further. People have found out that they're related to Brian Boru, for example, and this is all through DNA. To understand DNA, I might have to give a small explanation of what DNA is. It is basically a genetic code that is ingrained in our systems. It is split. It's a strand. It's a chromosome, and it is made up. And in the smallest units, it's called a nucleotide. DNA is made up of polynomers. The nucleotides become polynomers when they're joined together, and it has a series of bases. You're probably familiar with the twisted ladder image, and the rungs of that ladder are called bases, and they are called adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and from now on I'll call them by their initials because I'm going to get them mixed up. A and T are always opposite each other, as G and C are, and it is the order of these, as the way that these bases are sequenced, that inform how we look or how we act. An STR is a short tandem repeat, and is when a bunch of these bases follow the same basic pattern along a DNA strand. An SNP, or a SNP, is when there is a break in the STR. It's when there's a genetic mutation and the pattern is brought to a stop. Now, when people are studying DNA in relation to genealogy, there are some things you might need to understand. There are a couple of tests. There's the Y-DNA test, which is based on the Y chromosome, only found in males. There is the autosomal DNA test, which is basically a family finder and will look into all your DNA. There's the mtDNA test, or the mitochondrial DNA test, and this looks into the DNA along the maternal line, because mtDNA passes from mother to child, so even though males have it, they cannot pass it on. Now, the O'Brien Surname Project, this is a very interesting project because it can tell us how the O'Briens are related to Brian Boru. And there's actually five, different strands of O'Briens after finding so far. There are the people who are direct descendants of Brian Boru. This is the Dalcashin line, and they're sometimes referred to the Irish type 3 or L226. These people are obviously of the Dalcashin line, and it has been said they can judge their DNA next to the DNA of his direct descendant, and we can tell that they are descendants of the man himself. Then we have the M222 line, or the Nile of the Nine Hostages line. This line comes from some of the other old Irish clans, but there is no direct link to these people from Brian himself, so it's likely that an ancestor may have taken on the name for numerous reasons. This seems to be evident in a number of other in a number of other O'Briens, because there's also the haplogroup which is, they've got no connection at all to seemingly any of the old Irish clans, and maybe, like I said, an ancestor just took up the name. There's also the Viking chapter, where they seem to have Viking blood, and again, the O'Brien name pops up. Actually, the latest in a series of tests they found a new strand of O'Brien DNA. This is called the Thomond group, and so far they've identified 12 members who carry this SNP, or that's how they usually tell which group you belong to. Now, I mentioned haplogroup, and I probably should have said this before. Imagine the world as a giant family tree, and each branch off the tree is a haplogroup. So the Dalcassian line, everyone in the Dalcassian group would be a haplogroup. A haplotype then is a signature of sorts, and a group of people of the same haplotype will create a haplogroup. So your haplotype determines which haplogroup you find yourself in.
Fantastic. Very, very interesting. And just to imagine that Brian Boru, Queen Elizabeth II, can have Brian Boru as a common ancestor through it as Isabel de Clare and that line in the 13th century. So this isn't divorced from a very wide world indeed, giving us some imaginable facts that help us relate to each other and join us at this very time. Now, Brian Boru was married a number of times and had a number of issues. So all that documentary evidence in Cognate Whale, and that's freely available online, can be looked to see how we fit this world that is very different to our own. Brian indeed did take over Limerick and took it back from the Vikings, and the Boroivas and the tribes and the tributes are really important, because when we look at those in detail, we find that Brian Boru's tribute was very, very heavy, and it would in fact turned the Vikings into slaves in Limerick at that time. The Dalcassians' place in Thomond is really interesting as well, because Thomond became modern-day County Clare, but Thomond had at once covered West Tipperary, Limerick, and so on, certain parts of Tipperary, Limerick, and so on. It was a very wide, extensive area. But the Dalcash were pushed out of Thomond, and that limited it to the modern-day County Clare by the 16th century. But they pushed back to West Clare, and they ousted out the O'Connors on the west coast. And it also gave rise to these tribal groupings, the Cashan, becoming lordships, such as the McNamaras, establishing lordships of their own and becoming lords of Clancullen, basically taking over all of East Clare, building up to 80 to 90 castles. In later times, in the 1400s, prior to that, you would have had the Mottes and Baileys and ring forts, all leaving massive legacies of protection and so on. So Brian Boru in the world of DNA, yesterday we looked at the talk, and Hannah O'Sullivan brought in the idea of the Cheddar Man and what we can archaeologically do, and how the Cheddar Man has changed since the start of DNA research and finished. And we will be having a radio show with Hannah on the Cheddar Man, because that too warrants a show of its own, and this was over an hour-long show yesterday. So do you think it's of huge relevance that we're now looking at DNA?
Yes, it's massive relevance. Like, as I said, DNA has come a long way in the last couple of years. And you can find out about stuff that you didn't even know that you had in your DNA. For example, I forgot to mention this earlier, you could have an O'Brien in your tree, or even a variant of the name, and not realise it, because this is how the other haplogroups came up, because people would have changed their names for numerous reasons: landholding reasons, religious reasons, political gain. And one reason could have been informal adoption, where an old spinster or a bachelor may have taken in a young boy if they had a large estate and they needed to pass it on, but they didn't have an heir. The estate then would have been passed on to the boy, and he would have taken on the name. So many O'Briens could have actually left their name behind, or someone else may have inherited the name when they don't have any real connection.
And this is very interesting because of one of the things that we will cover in a radio show is fosterage. That fosterage is a big, big part of Gaelic society. Also, tanistry, which is not eldest son inheritance. It's election So you could have someone becoming the O'Brien, but maybe they're not the O'Brien. They were out of a pool of a common great grandfather. That can have a multiplicity of 216 people having a right to be elected, and the issues are there that you have a new dynamic happening. So maybe they become the O'Brien and you think, oh, well, why are they O'Regan and why am I not getting this? But because of the way the descendant is through both branches, and yet some of these tests are just taking into account a male offspring. So the world of DNA, because it's widened out a lot and become far more specific, has a great deal to show us as well. And we also would have looked at how the trees, there are over 9 billion trees online now. So you can maybe link up to going back 5 or 6 generations and so on. So I'd like to ask Aisling about the goals of the project.
The surname project, there's many surname projects out at the moment, but the O'Brien surname is unique in that they have DNA evidence from the ancestor that they'd like to trace you back as far as we know that Brian Boru has a direct relative living at the moment.
Who is he, actually?
Sir Conor O'Brien, sorry. He's still living at the moment, and he still holds the title of Prince of Thomond and the Earl of Inchnicken. Now, the goals of the project are as follows: to distinguish between the numerous ancestral lines that are rooted in the O'Brien surname, including all the possible variations, such as the names that we mentioned above, like Bryant, O'Brien with an A. All those kind of names.
There are an awful lot of variants. So you have O'Brien, Brian, Bryant, Brienne, Breen. Mm-hmm. There are, and John Grenham's Irish Ancestor site is an excellent site for looking at all the variants of surnames. And also realising that names, as people went to more anglicised parts of the world, that they may have dropped their Brian and become Brian. B-R-I-A-N rather than B-R-I-E-N and so on. They would have been pronounced rather than spelt.
Yeah. So if you have any of these names, you can actually participate in the project still. You just have to join the Y-Search program and upload your GEDCOMP, which is a file that's created by every family tree software product. You must be willing to share your male ancestry, either in pedigree charts or a family group sheet, so that the results can be researched. At the moment, I think they have around 500 members, but it's only proven that about 100 have actual connections to Brian. So it's interesting to find these kind of facts, because even as a child, we're all told. I remember Brian was told that they're related to Brian Boru.
Yes.
And so it's amazing what just a swab of even saliva can.
And just to make a note that you have the O'Briens of Thomond, but you also have the O'Briens of Ara as well, and you also have them in Waterford as well. And that becomes about, we know, because in the 13th century, when Thomas de Clare came to Ireland, and there was a fierce civil war between the O'Briens in the 13th century, and they divided out into branches very quickly. And some of those got expulsed into Waterford and so on. And of course you have Pobble Brian as well, which was an area with the O'Briens. So just as that clan really expanded and became a very strong lordship, they also had their detractors who wanted to murder them as well. And it's very important to note that clans could split and divide, and some forms could become very dominant, and then you would have junior cadet branches leading off those as well. So Aisling, have you enjoyed your work on Brian Boru and the world of DNA?
I have. It's very interesting, and I suppose it's got a personal link to me as an O'Brien myself. I know my own relatives are very interested in this as well, and they would be interested in taking part in the project, which will be a good thing, because as they said, every project is only as good as the people who partake in it. So yeah, it's very interesting just to find out about your own past.
Fantastic. So Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your listening today for our Brian Boru and the World of DNA. And we'll be podcasting the show out and it's repeated on a Sunday. We've got a number of events coming up in Nina in May. We've got some classes occurring there. So if you want any information on that, do email irishroots@clansandsurnames.com. And also there are ventures to have a number of other shows. We've got over 20 shows planned. So we will be continuing right up till August and then coming back on air in September. There will be no break on the Genealogy radio show this year. And some of our shows are church records, landed estate records, the Farrells, the McCormacks, the O'Sullivans, and so on. And so with some really interesting stuff as well. So thank you very much for listening. And that's all for today.